All right. On the Beis Medal of 32a. So at the bottom of the page, fourth to last line, second to last word, Vahatanya. So the Gemara asserted that the reason why one may not take a Torah and use it for Tefillin, or take Tefillin and use it for Mezuzah, is because one may not demote an item from a higher Kedusha to a lower Kedusha. And the assumption is that otherwise everything is equal. All things being equal, the only difference is that one is of a higher standing in holiness and one's a lower standing. And the Gemara now challenges that on a number of grounds. The first thing we challenged was with respect to the open paragraph between Shema and V'hayim Shemai, between the first and second paragraph, open versus closed, and we try to address that by saying, perhaps talking about attaching two pieces, like Rashi said, or maybe using the bottom half of the margin to continue writing the rest of your Mezuzah from a Tefillin, from a Torah. But the only problem being that it's the motion. Now the Gemara is going to go through a number of different halachas, comparing Tefillin, Torah, and Mezuzah to see if they match up. And the only reason why you wouldn't use one for the other is because you're not allowed to demote a text rather than promote it. Yeah? Okay, Tanya. So the Gemara asks like this. Okay, so back up three more words. Hamaridin. But if we were to be allowed to demote a Torah to a lower level of Mezuzah Tefillin, are you saying we would do it? Is there nothing else holding us back from using it, well, in this case, Tefillin to a Mezuzah? Only the fact that Tefillin's of a higher Kedusha? Is that the only distinction? Well, Tanya, for what we've learned, Halacha Moshe Sinai, we have a law that's been passed down from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, every halacha is passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu. But what this means is, the different ways of understanding what this actually means and depends on the scenario. But every law in Torah is derived by the 13 principles of interpretation that Moshe Rabbeinu received at Sinai. What makes halacha like this unique, where the Gemara says halacha l'Moshe Sinai, morning, means that this halacha is either one of two things. Either Moshe Rabbeinu himself came to a conclusion using those 13 principles, and therefore because it's been accepted by Moshe Rabbeinu, it remains that way. Kind of like anytime any generation comes to a conclusion using the principles, the next generation doesn't disagree with it, but rather accepts it and moves forward with it, like the Rambam describes in his introduction to Gemara. Or, and this is more likely, is that Moshe Rabbeinu himself came with this halacha from Hashem, irrespective of any interpretation of the verse. In other words, this is part of the oral tradition, not in the sense that this is derived by the 13 principles, but in and of itself, this is a halacha that was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu by Hashem. And for some reason, especially when it comes to tefillin, there are many such things. For example, the fact that it's square, the fact that it's black, and many other such halachas which we'll learn about with respect to the tefillin are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, not derived by any verse, but just because this is what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's more likely the meaning here. So halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it's a law that we have from Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai, all the way back to the beginning. That tefillin ought to be written ala klaf on the parchment. Right? We described before that the cowhide has two layers. The outer layer upon which the hair grows, and the inner layer, which is like a thinner membrane between the skin and the rest of the flesh, essentially. Those are the two layers of the hide. So tefillin ala klaf, that tefillin ought to be written on a parchment, on a klaf, on the outer layer. Mezuzah ala dusus, and the mezuzah should be written on the thinner layer, on the inside layer. I don't know if this is the actual practice today. I'm not sure if they use different parchments for tefillin and mezuzah. I don't think so for some reason. I'm going to double check with my brother-in-law, God willing. And then that's the first halacha we received from Sinai. That tefillin ought to be written on a klaf, on a parchment, and mezuzah has to be written on a dosustos, on the inner membrane. And then the second tradition we have from Moshe Rabbeinu is that klaf, when you are writing on a klaf, when you're writing on a parchment, the makam basar, you should write it on the place where the flesh is. Now, even though there's a dosustos between the klaf and the flesh, but it means on the inner side. So you can write on either side of the parchment, either the side that has the hair or the side that has that's inside facing towards the flesh. So when you're writing on the klaf, when you're writing on this outer parchment, then you're writing on the side that's facing the inside, facing the flesh. Dosustos, if you're writing on a dosustos, you're writing on the membrane in between the parchment and the flesh. But makam aser, then you write it on the outside, the one facing the hair. So it would seem like you're always using the cleaner side In other words, you have two layers like this. So from the top layer, you're using the inside, which is facing the other membrane, and from the membrane, using the inside facing the skin. So you're always using the cleaner side because this side's facing flesh and this side has hair. All right, so you're using the cleaner side. That's what it seems like. So this seems to, the point being here that as far as we're reading it right now, it seems like this is a requirement. Now, if that's the case, then you cannot demote Tefillin to Mezuzah, not only because the issue of demotion, but because they're actually written on different pieces of animal hide. Tefillin is written on a cloth on the parchment, and the Mezuzah is written on the dosustos, on the membrane. So the issue of going from Tefillin to Mezuzah is not an issue of demotion, but an issue of different pieces of parchment.
But so what?
Now, the Gemara is... Sorry?
So
the halacha remains the same. It's all a theoretical exercise.
It's this piece of paper, this piece of paper.
It's a theoretical exercise. In other words, you are sort of the only reason why I'm not allowed to use it tefillin is because it's the motion, but it seems like there are other problems. The Gemara is going to try to derive that from the fact that the Mishnah relies on the demotion factor means that every other halacha is the same. So indeed, the halacha, so the theoretical question actually has practical implication. You can see in a minute the Gemara is going to actually change the halacha from some Sinai somewhat, or reframe it in such a way that tefillin and mezuzah can be made the same, which changes the halacha because of the theoretical fact, because of the fact that the Mishnah only relies on the issue of the problem of demotion.
I was going to ask you if the outer membrane has some sort of a greater value of some kind than the inner membrane.
I don't know.
The inner membrane is from Mezuzah, right? The inner one.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, maybe that's why it's
a higher.
Is it some sort of higher quality of?
Other than, so far as I know,
it's or something. I don't know.
I don't know if it's higher quality, but my understanding is that the outer one is definitely stronger than the inner one. But better quality, I can't tell you.
Stronger in terms of the texture.
Yeah, texture. I'll give you an example. There's dakas and gasas, right? The tefillin, the box of tefillin can be made from thick animal hide or thinner. So from a cow versus from a sheep. Right? Dakas versus gasas. So there's a plus and minus in either one. So for a long time, or to some degree, the gasas, the thinner ones, are a better type. Why? Because first of all, they're much more easily moldable. Right? They're softer leather, much easier to mold, and you can get them more easily to make them square. Actually square. Right? The downside is they don't last as long because they're thin. So just as easy as it is to mold it in the way you want it, it's also easy to come apart. Right? Now the thicker ones, at least till recently, before we had hydraulic clamps, no one used the thicker animal hide because it was impossible to make it square, right? Making the thinner leather more popular. But now that we have hydraulic pressure, almost nobody uses the thinner skin. Why would you do that? Even it's easier to, now we have hydraulic pressures, so you make a nice big thick square, and it stays like this for years and years and years, and you keep the same tefillin for your whole life, essentially. People do that. So it's kind of like you see, like an up and down. I think this is a gasas. You can kind of see it's a little thinner. Then up and down either side. So I don't know if the outer cloth is better or worse, but it's definitely stronger, so far as I know. Anyway, the Gemara says, okay, so the Gemara's question right now is that you are suggesting the only reason why you're not allowed to take a tefillin and use it for mezuzah is because tefillin is of a higher holiness, and yet here we learn from Halach L'Moshe Messina they're actually written on different pieces of parchment, or different parts of the parchment, the outer one or the inner one, the klaf or the duchsostos. So says the Gemara, the mitzvah. This is not a requirement, but rather an added bonus. That's the word mitzvah means. In halacha, there's different types of ways of describing an obligation. Chiyuv, which means an obligatory, minhag, custom, and then you have mitzvah. Mitzvah means it's an added bonus, even though in another context, mitzvah means a requirement. But in the context of when you're writing halacha, mitzvah means an added bonus, not that it's required. So it's an added bonus if you had the tefillin like on the cloth and the mezuzah on the duchsostos, but they can be written in either or. But the Gemara asks, well, that can't be the case, because v'hatanya, where we learned, shina, if you switched, you wrote that which you're supposed to write, well, you switched in these issues of Halach L'Moshe Messina that we just read, that the tefillin have to be written on the cloth and the mezuzah on the duchsostos. And number two, that when you're writing on a cloth, you're writing on the inner side of the cloth. And when you're writing on the duchsostos, you're writing also on the inner side. Which is either...
The outer side.
Outer side.
The outer side, sorry, inner side, meaning in between the klaf and the duchstustus.
The same place.
But the same place where it's cut. That's right. This, the place where it's split from each other.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. The inner side from each other. Yeah. So in that area, we learned shina pasul. If you changed one of these two things, seemingly pasul, it is invalid. So it's not just the mitzvah. It's not just for an added bonus. It's actually a requirement, because otherwise it's invalid. That's what this text says. It says the Gemara of Tefillin, when it says that if you switched, it's invalid. It's talking about tefillin, meaning like this: tefillin must be written on a klaf. Mezuzah can be written on either. That's what it would mean. So when the Mishnah says that if you change, it's invalid, it's only talking about a tefillin. So tefillin must be written on the klaf on the outer side of the skin. The mezuzah could be written either on the outer or the inner.
Tefillin on the
outer one, the klaf, the thicker one, on the inner side of the klaf.
I thought when you cut, you wrote on the inside.
Right, but on the top, on the inside of the top one.
A parchment.
Okay.
The inside of the top one.
Okay.
Right, not the membrane, the klaf. So that has to be written like that. If you switch that, that's invalid. But mezuzah could be written in either, but it's the mitzvah, it's an added bonus if you wrote it on the duchstustus. This is the way it would seem at the moment. So that way, what do we gain by saying this? What we gain is that tefillin could be used for mezuzah, because it's still kosher even if it's written on the other parchment, but the only reason is demotion. You're not allowed to demote. The Gemara further challenges. But for Tanya, we've learned shina bein bezeh or bein bezeh, whether you changed it in this one or in that one, pasul, it's invalid. The implication at the moment is that whether you change how the tefillin is supposed to be written, or whether you change how the mezuzah is supposed to be written, it's also invalid. Meaning, you cannot use the parchment of tefillin for mezuzah, even if they were of the same level of holiness. Because it says, shina bein bezeh, whether you changed in this one, or you changed that one, it's invalid. Meaning, even if you wrote the mezuzah on the thicker parchment, like the tefillin, it would be invalid. So why do I need to rely on the demotion issue? The Gemara says, tefillin. Actually, when it says changed in this or changed in that, they're both talking about tefillin. But the two elements of tefillin. This one problem is writing on the outer part of the upper klaf, right? We said that when you're writing on a klaf, when you're writing on the thicker part of the parchment, you have to be writing on the inside, the part that faces the inside of the animal. So here he's writing on the outer side of the outer one. That's problem number one. Vaha, and the other change that the Mishnah mentioned, to Kasvinu, where he wrote, but aduchsustus on the membrane, on the inner membrane, the makam basa on the inner side. Right? So we have two parchments. And we're saying that tefillin has to be written on the outer one, number one. And number two, when you're writing on the outer one, you have to write it on the inside of the outer one. So you have two issues that could go wrong. Number one, you could be writing it on the outer klaf. You could be writing on the outer side of the outer klaf, the top side of the outer klaf, or you could be writing on the inside one of the inner one. And either of those problems becomes an issue, and therefore, in theory, tefillin could be used for mezuzah, because mezuzah is not stuck by these prohibitions. It's rather only a plus, but it would still be valid were it not for the issue of demotion. Mm-hmm. This is where the Mishnah Gemara is right now.
But with the chila, if you're starting from the outset to write what would normally use for tefillin for mezuzah, it's not a demotion, right? Is it?
No, demotion is only once.
Once you've done.
Once you've used something for a higher. Once you've already
designated,
it's actually a good question whether designated or actually used. But let's just assume that it's not by designation; it's by usage.
Exactly.
Let's just assume, for argument's sake, because that's the discussion itself. But let's say it's already used for tefillin. That's when the issue of demotion comes. If it's in the outset, it doesn't make a difference. You can write it however
if someone wanted to write mezuzah and all he had available was what's normally used to write tefillin, it would be fine.
It would seem like it's kosher at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Should be an issue.
The Gemara gives another option. That actually, with respect to changing, the Gemara goes back to saying that perhaps the issue of changing is an issue both for tefillin being used by that which mezuzah should be done, and likewise for mezuzah being done by that which tefillin should be done. Which means that tefillin cannot become mezuzah even if it weren't an issue of demotion, because they're actually made of different materials. That's what the Gemara is suggesting right now. The Gemara is switching back to that. But Tanoi, it's a question of a dispute. So one version, the reason why you can't use tefillin for mezuzah is because of the motion, and according to another view, the reason why you can't use tefillin for mezuzah is because they're actually different materials. That's actually a dispute, and that is Tanya. For we learned shina bazeh bazeh, whether you changed in this one or that one, which means whether you use that which you're supposed to use for mezuzah for tefillin, or whether you use that which mezuzah is supposed to be written for tefillin, it's possible, it's invalid. Either way, which means according to this view, you do not need to rely on the issue of demotion in order for the tefillin not to be used as mezuzah, because they're actually made by different materials. But Rav Acha machsher mishum Rav Acha bar Chanina. But Rav Acha permits in the name of Rav Acha son of Chanina. Others say it wasn't Rav Acha bar Chanina, it was Rabbi Akiva bar Chanina. But either way, according to this view, you may use different either material for either type. You may use either one for either, and the only reason why you're not allowed to demote tefillin to mezuzah is because of the issue, the prohibition against demotion. So it comes out that there's a dispute. Everybody agrees you can't use a tefillin to make it into mezuzah, but it's a dispute whether or not in the first instance you can mix up the materials. According to one of you, you can't mix up the materials. But what's required for tefillin, the outer cloth, has to be used that one, and what's required for mezuzah, the duchsos, has to be used for that one, and therefore the fact that tefillin cannot become mezuzah has nothing to do with the issue of demotion. It just has to do with the fact that they're different materials. Right. But according to the other view, in the outset, you could use either material for either, even though maybe it's better to use one over the other. And the only reason why you can't use a tefillin for mezuzah is because of the issue, the prohibition against demotion. So,
as far as what we do today, you're going to check.
So I'm going to ask my brother-in-law, but it doesn't see. I mean, look at this mezuzah. It doesn't look. This mezuzah looks like a duchsos to you. It looks like a klaf.
It seems a lot like tefillin is not, but it doesn't change.
Sorry? So I'm saying it seems like.
By the letters in the.
Yeah, but the mitzvah. But the mitzvah.
Yeah.
In other words, like feel this parchment. This is a tefillin. Versus feel this one. This one seems even thicker.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't. I'm going to find out whether people use duchsos at all. Because even though you're right, it seems like from the footnotes there that the halacha is that you may use mezuzah, you may use either for mezuzah, but still it says the mitzvah, at least for an added bonus, to use the duchsos. That's at least what's implied from the Gemara here.
Yeah, but it seems this parchment is thicker than.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so it seems
even though the Gemara does leave us with the option that it's permissible to use mezuzah, to use either for mezuzah, it still nevertheless says the mitzvah for some added bonus to use the duchsos. So why wouldn't we do that added bonus today?
Yeah, that's what we do. It seems there are different parchments from mezuzah.
You think it is different?
Yeah, it looks like.
But this one looks thicker, which means if anything, this is not the duchsos. If anything, this is the klaf. In other words, the mezuzah should be thinner, not thicker. That's what it would seem to me.
Yeah. Unless they cut it.
Unless they
like
treat it in some way that it becomes so thick. I'm going to find out. Sefer Torah we mentioned.
That feels like Sefer Torah.
Yeah, this feels much thicker, right? That's what I'm saying. Sefer Torah, so far as I know, is only used klaf, not duchsos. Right? Didn't we have it before about?
Also Gavil.
Sefer Torah and Tefillin be the same parchment?
It seems at the moment, yeah, Sefer Torah and Tefillin will be the same parchment. Yeah. It also could be the way they treat it. In other words, mezuzah has to be rolled up so small and so thin, especially if you have a small tefillin. Like you have to treat it to the point that it becomes much thinner. And maybe the mezuzah is left a little untreated, so it's a little thicker. I don't know. I'm going to find out, God willing, exactly what the common practice is till today.
Who would know?
Sorry?
Sure.
A sefer would know. Yeah, my brother-in-law's a sefer. I'm going to ask him. Okay, we're going to introduce the next halacha, but tomorrow, God willing, we'll get to much more details with the actual halacha, not the Shulchan Aruch, with respect to shirtot. Let's just introduce it. Gemara asks, Hamaridin Oisin, are we suggesting now, at least according to that view, that the only thing preventing us from using a tefillin and making it into mezuzah is the issue of demotion, but everything else is equal? Vaboy shirtot, but there are different. But with respect to mezuzah, the halacha is you're required to make lines. This what's it called? Scoring. The lines in the top of each, like these little scratch, these indentations to keep the line right at the top of the top of each line. Yeah, you want to see it? You can see this little indentation there, little scratch. And therefore, if that's the case, mezuzah needs that, and tefillin doesn't need that. So the reason why seemingly you couldn't use for a tefillin mezuzah is because they're actually different requirements, not just because of the issue of the motion. As the Gemara said, Amar of Nemi Bar Chilkiah. Rabbi Nomi, son of Chilkiah, said, Amar Rav Chama bar Geria, the name of Rav Chama bar Geria, Amar Rav, the name of Rav. Kol mezuzah, any mezuzah, any mishuretetas, any mezuzah which does not have those scores, so it's invalid. Rabbi Nomi bar Chalika today, and Rabbi Nomi himself added, so Rabbi Nomi before was speaking the name of Chama and the name of Rav, but he himself added, from some other tradition I suppose, shirtut, that this idea that mezuzah has to have scoring, shel mezuzah of the mezuzah, hilchah mishusina, actually is actually a tradition dating back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So if that's the case, you cannot use tefillin for mezuzah, because tefillin does not need the scoring, and mezuzah doesn't need the scoring. The Gemara says Tanoi, it's actually a dispute whether or not tefillin requires scoring or not. The Tanya, for we've learned, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Mishum Rabbeinu, in the name of Rabbeinu, tefillin mezuzah nechtavas shalom and aksav, tefillin mezuzah do not need to be written while you're looking at a text. You can do it from memory. Whereas Torah is too long, you can't do it from memory. You have to do it by copying word for word. Whereas mezuzah and tefillin can be done from memory. And likewise, ein tzich and shitut, both the tefillin, neither the mezuzahs, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, need scoring. Neither of them need scoring. Right? And therefore, it's a dispute between one and the other. And therefore, according to the view that says, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, which says tefillin and mezuzah are the same, and that they both don't need scoring, then the only reason why you can't use tefillin for mezuzah is because of the issue of demotion. Whereas according to the view which says that tefillin does not require scoring, mezuzah does require scoring, then the reason why you can't use tefillin for mezuzah is not just because of demotion, but because they actually have different requirements. One does not need a scoring, and one does need scoring. And the Gemara concludes. We'll conclude with this, and tomorrow we'll get to the actual halacha of what the practice is. The halacha is tefillin loy boy shirtut. Tefillin does not need scoring. Mezuzah boy shirtut. Mezuzah does need scoring. Otherwise, it's not kosher. And both of them, tefillin and mezuzah, nechtav shleim and aksav, do not need to be written by copying word for word from another text. It can be done by heart. My time was the reason Migay is Garcinon, because everybody says Shema all the time, so we know it by heart, and therefore does not need a text to compare it to. As a kind of joke, I might add that here's proof that people in the Gemara wore Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. Here's proof that people wore Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. What's the proof? Because the tefillin has 4 parshas: Shema, V'Hayim Shemaya, Kadesh Li, and Kolpa and Vaydaber, no? Shema V'Hayim Shemaya, V'Hayik V'Yacha. So there's 4 parshas, and the Gemara suggests that all 4 parshas of tefillin, people know them by heart because they're saying them all the time. When does a regular Jew say all 4 parshas? If you wear tefillin B'nai Tam, you say all 4 parshas. So here's a proof for the Gemara's time that people wore tefillin B'nai Tam because they were familiar in all 4 parshas. It's not a joke, but anyway, a wonderful day, everybody.